Why was she the only one not speaking when the briefing room fell silent? The room smelled like stale coffee and dust baked into fabric by too many deployments. 8 men sat around the table, broad shoulders, scarred hands, quiet confidence earned the hard way. And then there was her, Reese Thorne, 5'3", medical patch on her shoulder, notebook open, pen steady, eyes down. No one asked her opinion. No one expected one. She had learned that early. Silence was safer than trying to prove something to people who had already decided who you were. Still, the words stung when they came. Not shouted, not cruel, just dismissive. Support role, someone muttered. Doc, here to patch holes, not make decisions. Reese swallowed the familiar heat behind her eyes and focused on her breathing. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The way her father taught her when the world felt heavy. Afghanistan wasn't forgiving, neither were expectations. Outside, the sun hammered the compound walls like a warning. Inside, maps flickered on screens. Coordinates, routes, timelines. The mission was supposed to be clean, too clean. That thought bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Because perfect missions didn't exist. Only traps dressed as certainty. And there was something else. A quiet itch at the back of her mind. A memory she didn't share. A truth she kept folded away like a letter you don't open because you already know it will hurt. Her father had died believing someone betrayed them. And today, the same names were on the board. What does it feel like when you realize you don't belong, and might never be allowed to? The first night in country, Reese lay awake on her cot listening to helicopters chew the darkness apart. Every sound reminded her she was a guest in a brotherhood built long before she arrived. She wasn't angry, just tired. She had earned her place on paper: combat medicine, field evacuations, stabilizing men under fire, dragging bodies heavier than her through hell, but paper didn't erase doubt. They saw her size first, then her gender, then her role, and somewhere far down the list, her skill. She ran before dawn, boots slapping against hard-packed earth, lungs burning, legs screaming. Pain was honest. Pain didn't judge. When she ran, the noise in her head quieted. Her father used to say, "If you can keep moving when everything in you wants to stop, you'll survive most things." She missed him most at moments like this, when the weight of expectation pressed harder than a rucksack ever could. Back in her quarters, she opened the old rifle case she never talked about. The wood was worn smooth, the metal clean, familiar, her father's rifle, not regulation, not modern but precise, honest, unforgiving. Too heavy for someone her size, they'd said. She had learned to let the rifle answer for her. She closed the case again. Not yet. There would be a time, but not now. Not until she had no other choice. Have you ever felt time slow? Not because you wanted it to, but because everything depended on it. The ambush began without warning. It always did. Gunfire tore through the ridgeline like a scream. The sound hit before the understanding. Shouts, commands, the sharp crack of rounds splitting stone inches from faces. Someone went down, then another. Reese was moving before fear could catch up. Training took over. Hands slick with blood that wasn't hers. Pressure, seal, breathe, stay with me. Above them, a machine gun chewed through cover with methodical cruelty. Each burst walked closer, too close. They were pinned, outnumbered, running out of time. She looked up the slope and saw it, the nest, distant, well-placed. Whoever said it knew exactly where they'd be. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't random. Someone had known. The radio crackled, air support delayed, minutes they didn't have. Reese's mind did something strange then. It narrowed, quieted. She felt the way she used to as a child, lying prone beside her father in the desert, listening to the wind tell stories about distance and direction. She didn't ask permission. She reached for the rifle. Hands moved on instinct, position built in seconds. Heat burned through her uniform. She ignored it. The world reduced itself to angles and wind and gravity. Too small, the voices echoed. She exhaled. The shot cracked the air. Silence followed, just for a breath. Then chaos broke the other way. One target down. Then another. Each pull of the trigger felt less like violence and more like inevitability. She wasn't proving anything. She was protecting people. When the gunfire finally faded, the team stared at her like they were seeing a ghost. She didn't look back. She was already scanning. Why does the truth wait until the cost is unbearable? After extraction, no one spoke about what she'd done, not right away. They moved differently around her now, quieter, watching. Respect came with distance. Later, when the adrenaline wore off, doubt returned. Not theirs, hers. Because the ambush confirmed what she'd feared. Someone had sold them out. That night, she pulled out her father's notebook, the one she never opened unless she had to. His handwriting slanted across the pages like a man always moving, always calculating. Dates, names, questions. The last entry stopped mid-sentence. If anything happens to me. She closed her eyes. The past wasn't buried, it was patient. And it was catching up. What does justice cost when the enemy wears your uniform? The investigation unfolded quietly, carefully, trust measured in inches. Every step forward felt like stepping onto thin ice. The names surfaced again and again. Clean record, decorated career, access to everything. Too clean. Watching him smile in briefings made her skin crawl. The way his eyes lingered. The way he spoke about risk like it was abstract. When the proof finally surfaced, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief. Years of betrayal, dozens dead, all for money, influence, control. When they took him away in cuffs, he didn't look angry. He looked exposed. "You're just like your father," he said to her. She didn't respond. Some truths don't deserve words. What remains after the noise fades and the ghosts are finally named. Weeks later, under a quiet sky far from gunfire, Reese cleaned the rifle again. The motions calmed her. The weight felt right. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a symbol. She was a soldier who had done what needed to be done when no one else could. The team stood differently around her now, not above, not below, beside. Her father's voice echoed softly in her memory, not loud, not proud, just steady. Aim true. Reese looked out at the horizon, where the light softened the hard edges of the world. Strength didn't announce itself. Resilience didn't ask permission. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the quiet feel heavier than the gunfire ever had? Reese noticed it the moment they returned to base. The way conversation stopped when she walked past. The way eyes followed her, then looked away. No jokes, no congratulations, just a silence thick with questions no one wanted to ask out loud. She understood it. She'd seen it before. When something breaks the shape people rely on, they don't know where to put it. A female corpsman wasn't supposed to end an ambush from nearly a kilometer away. Someone too small wasn't supposed to become the difference between living and being carried out in a bag. That kind of disruption made people uncomfortable. She cleaned her medical kit 3 times that night, even though it didn't need it. Tourniquets aligned, gauze stacked, morphine checked, order helped. Order made sense when people didn't. Across the room, her pack leaned against the wall. Inside it, wrapped carefully, was the rifle, her father's rifle, the one she hadn't been authorized to use, the one she hadn't asked permission to use. She told herself she'd deal with that later. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ridge line, the shimmer of heat. The moment before she squeezed the trigger, when the world went silent and simple, that place scared her a little. not because it was violent, but because it felt like home. She woke before dawn and went for a run. The base was quiet at that hour, the sky still bruised purple. Her boots hit the ground in a steady rhythm. Breathe in, breathe out, 4 steps, 4 steps, her father's cadence, her father's discipline. He had never treated her like she was fragile, never once said, because you're a girl. He taught her wind before algebra, distance before dadding, consequences before comfort. You don't rise to the moment, he'd said once, adjusting her elbow as she lay prone in the dirt. You fall back on what you've practiced, so practice right. Back then, she hadn't understood why his voice sometimes carried sadness, why his eyes scanned empty hills like he expected them to answer back. Now she did. By the time the sun crested the horizon, Reese's legs burned and her lungs screamed, but her mind felt clearer. She slowed near the range, an instinct pulling her there. The gates were locked, officially closed this early. She stopped anyway. Just looking. Targets stood in the distance, pale shapes against the berm. Her fingers twitched slightly. Muscle memory. The urge to measure when she didn't need to shoot. She forced her hands still. Not yet. Later that morning, the team gathered for a debrief. Official, clinical. Words like unexpected resistance and effective response floated around the room. Reese listened, nodding when appropriate, speaking only when directly addressed. No one mentioned the rifle. Not until Barrett Drummond finally did. He waited until the room was nearly empty, until only a few remained. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You want to explain how a corpsman just outshot half the people I've trained with. The question wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. Reese met his eyes. She didn't flinch. I grew up shooting. Drummond let out a short breath, half laugh, half disbelief. That rifle isn't standard issue. No, Chief. And you weren't authorized. No, Chief. Silence stretched. Reese felt the old anxiety creep in, the instinct to justify, to soften, to apologize. She pushed it down. She was tired of shrinking to make things easier. Finally, Drummond nodded once. You saved lives. It wasn't praise, it wasn't permission. But it mattered. Later, Senior Chief McKenna found her near the motor pool, sitting on a crate, relacing her boots. He didn't sit beside her, just stood close enough that his presence was felt. That shot you took, he said quietly, reminded me of someone. Reese didn't answer. Your father, McKenna continued. He had the same stillness, like the noise couldn't touch him once he committed. Her throat tightened. He taught me that. McKenna studied her for a long moment. That rifle wasn't just a weapon to him. It was responsibility. I know. And responsibility has a cost. She looked up at him then. So does hesitation. A corner of his mouth twitched. You're not wrong. The next mission brief came down 2 days later. Different region, different target, same unsettling sense of certainty. Intelligence was solid. Patterns were confirmed. Reese felt the itch return. During the briefing, she watched the intelligence officer more than the map. The way he deflected questions, the way his answers were polished, rehearsed, too smooth. Her father's notebook burned in her thoughts. Afterward, she approached McKenna. Can I ask you something off the record? He didn't hesitate. Walk. They moved along the perimeter fence, where the noise of generators drowned out conversation. My father believed someone inside fed positions to the enemy, she said. He never proved it, but he died trying. McKenna stopped walking. Why are you telling me this now? He asked. Because the ambush felt familiar, Reese replied. Too precise, too prepared, and because the same names keep appearing. McKenna's eyes hardened, not with anger but with recognition. You're opening a door that doesn't close easily. I know. And if you're wrong, then I live with that. He studied her like a man weighing a long memory against a present risk. Finally, he nodded. "I'll listen. That's all I promise." That night, Reese finally opened the notebook again. She read every margin note, every half-finished thought. Her father's doubts weren't paranoia. They were patterns. Someone had been cleaning the picture, removing uncertainty, selling confidence. The realization made her feel cold. She closed the notebook and rested her hands on the cover. "I see it now," she whispered. "I just didn't want to." The next day at the range, Sullivan surprised her. "You ever qualify on a sniper platform?" he asked, almost casually. "Yes, sir." "How recently?" "Last deployment." He nodded. "You'll run it again, standard, no special treatment." Drummond watched closely as she built her position. He said nothing. Neither did she. Words weren't the point. The first shot rang out. Dead center. The second came faster, then the third. The range fell quiet except for the echo. When it was over, the numbers spoke for her. Drummond exhaled slowly. "You don't shoot like someone trying to prove something," he said. "You shoot like someone who's already decided." Reese looked downrange. "I am." Decided to stop running from her father's shadow. Decided to trust what she saw, even when it scared her. Decided that being underestimated was no longer something to endure, but something to use. That night alone again, she cleaned the rifle carefully. Each motion deliberate, respectful, not reverent, but aware. She wasn't stepping into someone else's legacy. She was answering it. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the anxiety and the doubt, something steadied. A quiet resolve, not loud, not dramatic. Just ready. Because the truth was moving closer. And this time, she wouldn't look away. How do you know the moment you stop being a witness and become a threat? Reese felt it before anything actually happened. The shift. The invisible line she'd crossed without ceremony. Conversations grew guarded when she entered a room. Brief glances were exchanged, quick and subtle, like men checking wind before a shot. She wasn't imagining it. When you start asking the wrong questions, people notice. The next operation brief came down fast, faster than usual. Another high-value target, another isolated compound, another promise of clean lines and minimal resistance. Reese sat at the table, hands folded, eyes forward, listening with more than her ears. The intelligence officer spoke smoothly, confidently. Dates, coordinates, timelines, no hesitation, no uncertainty. Too perfect. Reese glanced at McKenna. He didn't look back, but his jaw was set, the way it only was when something didn't sit right. She recognized it now. She'd seen it in her father's old photos. Men who'd survived long enough learned to listen to discomfort. After the briefing, Reese lingered, pretending to check medical inventories while the room emptied. When the door finally closed, she spoke. "Sir," she said quietly to Sullivan, "permission to ask something off record." Sullivan looked tired, not physically, strategically. "You don't ask lightly," he said. "Go on." "The intel source," Reese said. "Has it changed recently?" Sullivan's eyes sharpened. "Why do you ask?" "Because the last 3 missions followed the same pattern," she replied evenly. "And the ambush wasn't luck." Silence pressed down. Sullivan leaned back, studying her. "You're walking into deep water, petty officer." "I already am, sir." A pause, then quietly, "Watch yourself." It wasn't permission. It wasn't a warning. It was both. That night, Reese barely slept. She replayed everything. Briefings, movements, names. Her father's notebook lay open on her bunk, pages filled with questions that had never been answered. "If something happens to me." She closed her eyes and felt the old anger rise, not sharp, not explosive. Cold, focused, the kind that waited patiently. Morning came with heat and dust and the familiar weight of armor. They moved out under a sky too clear for what waited ahead. Reese checked every seal, every strap, every breath. It grounded her. If she couldn't control the larger picture yet, she could protect what was within reach. The insertion went smoothly, too smoothly. They reached the overwatch position before dawn, settling into the rocks like shadows. Reese lay beside Drummond, spotting scope pressed to her eye. She read the terrain the way her father taught her, not just what was there but what shouldn't be. Guard patterns were disciplined, rotations tight, fields of fire overlapping with intention. "These aren't locals," she whispered. "They're trained." Drummond didn't argue. He didn't need to, he saw it too. Minutes stretched. Sweat trickled down Reese's spine despite the stillness. The sun climbed, the world sharpened, then movement, a vehicle approaching, dust plume, the target stepping into view. Drummond settled behind the rifle. And that was when everything unraveled. The first shots came from behind. Not wildfire, not panic, controlled bursts, coordinated angles, the sound of preparation. "Contact rear," someone shouted. The hillside erupted. Rounds slammed into rock. Stone exploded inches from faces. Reese rolled, heart hammering, already moving toward a fallen man. Blood, too much blood. Her hands worked on instinct, pressure, seal, stay with me. She barely registered the shouting until a deeper, heavier sound cut through it all. A machine gun. The position was perfect, elevated, covered, killing ground mapped with ruthless efficiency. Reese looked up and felt the world narrow again. She knew that gun, she knew what it would do. Palmer was exposed, another second and Reese didn't wait. She reached for the rifle. There was no debate in her head this time. No hesitation, just clarity. She built her position as if she'd done it 1,000 times under fire, because she had, just not here, not like this. Wind, distance, angle, gravity. Her father's voice lived in the math. The shot cracked, the machine gun stuttered, then died. She cycled the bolt, already finding the next target. Her shoulder screamed, but she barely noticed. Adrenaline burned everything else away. 1, 2, 3. The ambush faltered. Confusion rippled through the enemy line. Air support roared in moments later, finishing what she'd started. When it was over, Reese stayed on the rifle longer than necessary, scanning, breathing, grounding herself back in her body. When she finally looked up, the team was starring. Not with doubt. With something closer to awe and something else, fear. Because they'd just seen her do what she was never meant to do. Extraction was tense but clean. The silence in the helicopter was heavier than the firefight. No one spoke until they were airborne and clear. Sullivan finally broke it. How did they know where we'd be? No one answered. Because the answer was forming in all of them at once. Back on base, the mood shifted. Official reports were sanitized. Language softened. But beneath it all, something dark took root. Betrayal. That night, McKenna knocked on Reese's door. He didn't wait for an invitation. "I've been thinking about your father," he said. "So have I." He sat heavily on the chair opposite her. The mission he died on, the intel was airtight, too airtight, same pattern. Reese handed him the notebook. He read in silence, face hardening with every page. "When you fired today," he said finally, "I knew." Knew what? That this wasn't coincidence, and that if we don't expose it, more people will die. Reese nodded. "Then we can't be quiet anymore." McKenna looked at her, really looked, not as a corpsman, not as a sniper. As an equal. "You understand what this means?" he asked. "If we're wrong." "We won't be," she said. Not arrogance, certainty. Outside, helicopters lifted into the night, carrying other teams toward other missions, unaware of the rot beneath their feet. Reese watched the lights fade and felt the weight settle fully on her shoulders. Not the rifle's weight, but responsibility. She was no longer just reacting. She was hunting the truth. And the people who feared her most weren't wearing enemy uniforms anymore. What happens when the enemy realizes you see them and smiles back? The first sign was subtle, too subtle for anyone who wasn't already looking. A delay in clearance paperwork, a reassignment that made no operational sense, a last-minute change in transport that arrived wrapped in bureaucratic language and false reassurance. Reese noticed all of it. Patterns didn't need to shout. They whispered, and she had learned how to listen. She kept her face neutral, kept her voice even. If someone inside was watching her, and she was now certain they were, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing how close she was. The team felt it too, not all of them, but enough. Trust didn't disappear overnight. It thinned. Conversations became more deliberate. Humor lost its edge. Men who once spoke freely now measured every word like they were standing on ice that might crack. Reese found herself alone more often, not avoided, just unaccompanied, as if proximity itself carried risk. Late one evening, she sat on the concrete steps behind the medical bay, helmet beside her, hands resting loosely on her knees. The air smelled like fuel and dust. Somewhere, a radio played low, distorted music. She thought of her father again, of how lonely he must have been near the end, knowing something was wrong, knowing saying it out loud might cost him everything. Maybe it already had. McKenna joined her without a word, lowering himself beside her with a tired grunt. They sat in silence for a while, comfortable, heavy. "They're adjusting," he said finally. "They always do," Reese replied. He glanced at her. "You ever wish you stayed quiet?" She didn't answer right away. The question deserved honesty. "Sometimes," she said, "but not enough to stop." McKenna nodded slowly. "Good, because it's getting closer." The investigation, if that's what it could be called, was unofficial, dangerous, built on fragments and intuition rather than authority. That was intentional. The moment it became formal, it would be compromised. Reese and McKenna worked from the margins, comparing logs, watching movement, noticing who knew what and when. They didn't accuse, they observed. And someone was definitely observing them back. The smile came during a routine briefing. The intelligence officer, polished, confident, untouchable, caught Reese's eye just long enough. A flicker of recognition, amusement. He smiled. Not friendly. Not threatening. Knowing. Her stomach tightened. Afterward, she went straight to the range, hands shaking just enough to irritate her. She laid out the rifle with care, every motion precise, grounding. Control what you can. Breathe through what you can't. She fired until her shoulder ached and the world narrowed to targets and breath. Only then did the tremor fade. That night she dreamed of her father not as he'd been at the end but earlier, laughing, sunburned, whole. "You're doing right," he told her. She woke with tears on her face and no memory of when they'd started. The next mission was announced abruptly. A joint operation, larger force, shared command, too many moving pieces. Too many places for truth to get lost. Reese voiced her concern privately. "This isn't right," she said to Sullivan. "We're being rushed." Sullivan rubbed his temples. Orders came from higher. "That's what worries me." He studied her for a long moment. "You trust your instincts." "With my life." "Then keep your eyes open," he said quietly. "That's all I can officially ask." Unofficially, the message was clear. They inserted under cover of night. The terrain was unforgiving, sharp rock, narrow passes, blind angles everywhere. Reese felt exposed in a way she couldn't quite articulate, like a piece had been moved without her seeing the hand. Halfway to the objective, the lead element froze. Movement ahead. Too early, too accurate. Reese's heart sank. "Contact possible," someone whispered. Then the first shot rang out. Not at them. Near them. A warning. The radio crackled with overlapping voices. Confusion bloomed like a bruise. Reese scanned the ridgeline, spotting scope sweeping methodically. There, a figure silhouetted against the stars, not firing, watching. Another signal, another warning shot. They weren't here to kill them. They were here to herd them. Reese felt anger flare, hot and sharp. Not fear, not yet. Anger at the manipulation, the arrogance. "They know our path," she said into the mic. "They're steering us." "Who?" Drummond asked. "Someone with the map," she replied. The order came to push forward anyway. Reese's jaw tightened. They advanced step by careful step. The air grew tense, charged. Then it happened. An explosion, controlled, precise, blocking their retreat without touching the main force. A trap perfectly measured. Contact front. Left side. Medic. Reese was moving before the call finished, sliding to a wounded man, hands already slick with blood. Her mind split cleanly in two, one part treating, the other tracking. They were surrounded, but not overwhelmed. That mattered. This wasn't about eliminating them. It was about pressure. Someone wanted to see how they'd react. The machine gun opened up again, farther this time, smarter placement. Reese located it quickly, too quickly. She frowned. "Same position type," she murmured. "Same setup as before." Drummond looked at her sharply. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Yes." This was personal. Reese took the rifle without waiting. No announcement, no drama. She settled in, breath slow, heartbeat loud in her ears. Through the scope she saw movement, not frantic, not rushed. Calm, confident. The gunner wasn't panicking. He was waiting. Reese adjusted slightly. Wind tugged at her sleeve. Distance long but manageable. She hesitated. Something felt wrong. The gunner shifted, and in that fraction of a second Reese saw it. A signal flare in his pocket. He wasn't the threat. He was bait. "Wait," she said urgently. Too late. Another explosion rocked the ground closer this time. Dirt and stone rained down. Shouts filled the air. Reese rolled, heart pounding. They weren't reacting anymore. They were being tested. When air support finally arrived, the enemy melted away, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and unanswered questions. Extraction was silent. Back on base, the debrief was tense. Language was careful, blame distributed vaguely. Reese said little, she didn't need to. Later that night, she found an envelope on her bunk. No markings, no explanation. Inside was a single page. Coordinates, a time, and 3 words written in neat, deliberate ink. "You're getting close." Her hands went cold. McKenna arrived minutes later, drawn by the look on her face alone. She handed him the page. He read it once, then again. "They want you scared," he said. Reese shook her head. "No, they want me engaged." She looked at the coordinates, committing them to memory. Her father hadn't gotten this far. She would. Not because she wanted revenge, but because silence had already cost too much. And because somewhere, someone believed she'd back down now. They were wrong. She folded the page carefully and tucked it into her pocket. The truth was no longer hiding. It was inviting her in. What do you do when the truth stops running and waits for you? Reese stood alone on the flight line long before the sun rose. The coordinates burned into her memory like a brand. The air was cold, sharp enough to wake every nerve. Engines idled in the distance, low and patient, like predators conserving energy. She hadn't told anyone where she was going yet, not because she didn't trust them, but because the fewer people who knew, the fewer people could be hurt if this went wrong. And it could go wrong in ways she didn't want to imagine. She checked her gear with deliberate calm. Nothing extra, nothing sentimental. The rifle rested in its case beside her, heavier now not in weight but in meaning. It wasn't just her father's anymore. It had become a witness. McKenna arrived without surprise, as if he'd known she'd be there. He didn't ask where she was headed. He already knew. "You don't have to go alone," he said quietly. "I do," Reese replied. "If I don't, it becomes something else. Something louder, something messier." He studied her face, searching for hesitation. He didn't find any. Only resolve, layered over fear she wasn't pretending didn't exist. "Then take this," he said, pressing a small encrypted radio into her hand. "Open channel, you decide when it goes live." She nodded once. That was enough. The flight was short, too short for second thoughts. The terrain below shifted from hard lines to shadowed emptiness. When the aircraft peeled away, Reese was already moving, boots hitting ground with practiced certainty. The coordinates led her to an abandoned forward outpost, one that had been written off months ago after a logistical failure. The kind of failure that left no survivors and even fewer questions. She felt her chest tighten. This was where her father's last trail had gone cold. She approached carefully, scanning every angle, every silence. The compound sat half swallowed by dust and time, walls cracked, watchtowers leaning like tired men. No signs of recent activity, no footprints, no lights. Too quiet. Reese slipped inside, heart steady, senses sharp. The air smelled old, rust, burnt wiring, regret. She moved through rooms slowly, touching walls as if the place might remember something if she asked gently enough. Then she saw it. A light. Not bright, not obvious. A faint glow seeping from beneath a sealed door. Her pulse quickened, not with panic but recognition. Someone wanted to be found. She took position, listening. No voices, no movement, just the low hum of power. She breathed once, twice, then opened the door. Inside, the room was clean. Too clean for abandonment. A table, two chairs, a single overhead bulb, and a man standing near the far wall, hands visible, posture relaxed. The intelligence officer. He looked ordinary without the uniform, almost disappointed. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," he said calmly. Reese didn't raise the rifle. She didn't need to. Her voice came out steady. "You could have killed us, many times." He smiled faintly. "That was never the point." "Then what was?" she asked. He gestured to the chair opposite him, understanding. She stayed standing. He sighed. "Fair enough." He spoke without urgency, as if recounting a long-finished story. How intelligence became influence. How information, properly shaped, could move units, redirect resources, decide who lived long enough to matter. He never called it betrayal. He called it inevitability. "I didn't choose targets," he said. "I chose outcomes." Reese felt something crack inside her. Not anger, something colder. "My father," she said, "you chose his outcome." The man's eyes flickered for the first time, something like discomfort. He was inconvenient, too observant. "He trusted the system," Reese said. "That was his mistake." "No," the man corrected gently. "His mistake was believing the system had a conscience." The words hung between them. Reese thought of all the times she'd been ignored, dismissed, underestimated, and how that same blindness had protected her long enough to see this moment. "You let people die to protect yourself," she said. He shrugged. "I let people die to protect stability." She stepped closer. "You wanted me to see you." "Yes," he admitted, "because you're like him, and because if anyone could understand the cost." "I understand it," Reese interrupted, "better than you ever will." She activated the radio. McKenna's voice came through immediately. "We're live." The man closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, in resignation. When the arrest came, it was quiet. No struggle, no speeches, just the weight of truth finally settling where it belonged. Later, as dawn broke over the compound, Reese stood outside alone. The light softened the ruins, made them almost gentle. She felt empty, not relieved, not victorious. Just tired. McKenna joined her, keeping a respectful distance. "You ended something that's been killing people for years," he said. She nodded. "It doesn't bring them back." "No," he agreed, "but it stops the bleeding." Reese looked at the horizon, where the sun climbed slowly, patiently. "I thought I'd feel something else." McKenna smiled sadly. "Justice doesn't always feel like justice. Sometimes it just feels like the work is finally done." They returned to base to a different kind of silence, one that wasn't heavy, one that made room to breathe. The investigation went public enough to matter. Names were removed, records corrected, families given answers that had been delayed too long. Reese stayed out of the spotlight. She preferred it that way. One evening she visited the range alone, set up a single target, took her time. She fired one round. Clean, centered. She lowered the rifle and closed her eyes, imagining her father standing beside her, not watching, not guiding, just present. "I finished it," she whispered. The wind moved gently across the range, carrying the echo away. For the first time in a long while, Reese felt something close to peace. Not because the world was fixed, but because she had stopped running from the truth and survived what came next. And sometimes that's enough. What comes after the mission when the noise finally fades and you're left alone with who you've become? Reese didn't notice the quiet at first. Not really. Silence had always been part of her life, between shots, between words, between moments that changed everything. But this quiet was different. It didn't press in. It didn't demand anything. It simply existed like a cleared sky after weeks of dust storms. The base moved on quickly. It always did. New briefings replaced old ones. New threats took shape on fresh maps. The machinery of duty never paused long enough for reflection. That was how it survived. Reese moved with it, but something inside her had shifted. People spoke to her differently now. Not louder, not softer, just honestly. The sideways glances were gone. The doubt that once hovered like a shadow had burned away under daylight. She was no longer an exception or a curiosity. She was simply Reese. The rifle stayed locked away more often than not. She didn't need it to define her anymore. Its weight had transferred into her posture, her calm, the way she entered rooms without shrinking. One afternoon, she found herself back in the medical bay, stitching up a young operator with a shallow wound and a shaken expression. His hands trembled slightly as she worked. "You okay?" she asked gently. He nodded too fast. "Yeah, just first one." She smiled, small and understanding. "It doesn't ever get easy," she said. "You just learn how to carry it." He swallowed. "How do you?" Reese considered the question, then answered honestly. "I let it remind me I'm alive." Later, she sat alone on the same concrete steps behind the medical bay where she and McKenna had once spoken in fragments and half-truths. The radio played again somewhere nearby. Different song, same distortion. McKenna joined her after a while. He looked older than he had months ago. Not weaker, just worn in. "They offered you a formal transition," he said. "Different role, more visibility." She nodded. "I know." "And?" "I said no." He chuckled softly. "Didn't think you'd say yes." She watched a helicopter lift into the sky, rotors beating the air into submission. "I don't want to disappear into a desk," she said, "but I also don't need to chase what I already understand." McKenna studied her. "And what's that?" "That my worth isn't situational," she replied. "It doesn't depend on who's watching." He smiled then, not proud, grateful. The official closure came quietly. No ceremony, no applause, just a sealed report and a transfer order stamped with finality. The man who had orchestrated so much harm vanished into a system designed to erase its own mistakes. Reese didn't follow the trial. She didn't need to. She had already confronted the truth face to face. One evening she opened her father's notebook for the last time. She read the final unfinished sentence again. Let it land. Then, carefully, she turned the page and wrote beneath it, "You were right, and I finished it." She closed the notebook and placed it back in her pack, not as evidence, not as a burden, as history. Weeks passed, then months. The new mission came without urgency. Advisory role, training support, different pace, different stakes. Reese found herself teaching younger medics and operators, not just procedures but awareness. "Don't ignore discomfort," she told them. "It's data. Your body knows things before your mind catches up." They listened, not because she demanded it, because she had lived it. One afternoon at the range, she watched a young woman struggle to stabilize her breathing, frustration etched across her face. Reese stepped beside her, adjusting her stance with a light touch. "Don't fight the shake," she said quietly. "Acknowledge it, then breathe through it." The shot rang out clean. The woman turned, eyes wide. "I did it." Reese smiled. "You always could." As the sun dipped low, Reese walked the perimeter alone, the horizon painted in soft gold and shadow. She thought about the girl she had been when she first arrived, quiet, careful, carrying her competence like something fragile. She thought about the woman she was now, still quiet, but no longer careful. Strength hadn't arrived in a single moment. It hadn't been granted or recognized. It had been built, layer by layer, through restraint, through doubt, through choosing to act when silence would have been easier. Her father's voice returned one last time, not instructive, not urgent. "Proud." Reese stopped walking and looked out at the open land, the endless distance that once intimidated her. It didn't anymore. Distance was just space. Space could be crossed. She didn't need a title to validate her. She didn't need permission to trust herself. She had learned that courage wasn't loud. That resilience wasn't about enduring pain. It was about deciding what mattered enough to face it. As night settled in, Reese turned back toward the lights of the base, moving with an ease she hadn't known before. The world would keep testing people. Systems would fail. Truth would still hide behind convenience. But somewhere, a woman who had once been called too small now stood fully in her own presence, unmistakable, unignorable, and finally at peace with the silence she carried. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.